He believed every debt had a price. But before the sun set over Chicago, one quiet woman would force the most feared man in the city to question whether honor could ever be measured in dollars. The heavy iron gates of the DeLuca estate opened with a slow mechanical groan as Grace Williams stepped onto the long stone driveway, clutching a worn leather handbag with both hands. The autumn wind tugged gently at the sleeves of her faded navy coat, carrying the scent of rain across the perfectly trimmed hedges that surrounded the mansion like silent guards. Every step echoed against polished stone, sounding far louder than her heartbeat, although she could have sworn nothing in the world was louder than the fear pressing against her ribs. She had never imagined she would stand at the front door of Lorenzo DeLuca's home, not because of curiosity or ambition, but because of a promise whispered beside a hospital bed only 24 hours earlier. The massive oak doors opened before she could knock twice. A man in a dark suit studied her from head to toe, his expression unreadable. "State your business." Grace swallowed carefully before lifting her chin. "I'm here to see Mr. DeLuca." The man frowned. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Then you should leave." Grace reached into her handbag and removed a small envelope that looked almost insignificant against the marble entrance hall beyond the doorway. "Please tell him this concerns Daniel Williams." The guard's eyes changed almost instantly. He disappeared without another word, leaving Grace standing alone beneath the towering columns as cold air drifted through the open doorway. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours before another voice, calm and impossibly controlled, broke the silence. "Let her in." Grace stepped across the polished marble floor into a room filled with warm amber light, dark walnut walls, and shelves lined with hundreds of leather-bound books. At the far end stood Lorenzo DeLuca, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored, his silver watch catching the afternoon light as he rested one hand against the back of a leather chair. He did not raise his voice. He did not move toward her. Yet somehow the entire room seemed to revolve around his quiet presence. Grace stopped several feet away, keeping both hands around the envelope as though it were the only thing preventing her from falling apart. Lorenzo watched her carefully, saying nothing. He had seen frightened people before. He had seen angry people, desperate people, dishonest people. But this woman looked different. She looked exhausted, as though grief had quietly settled into every corner of her life without stealing the dignity from her eyes. Finally, Grace drew one slow breath and placed the envelope on the polished desk between them. "My father passed away yesterday," she said softly, her voice trembling only for a moment before becoming steady again. "But I came to pay his debt." The words settled over the room with a silence so complete that even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to hesitate before its next tick. Lorenzo lowered his eyes toward the envelope without touching it. Then he looked back at Grace with an expression she could not read. "Tell me something," he said quietly. "Do you even know what your father borrowed from me?" Grace lowered her eyes for only a moment before meeting Lorenzo DeLuca's gaze again, refusing to hide behind excuses she did not have. "No, sir," she answered honestly. "I only know that my father believed it was his responsibility until his last breath, and now it is mine." The room remained perfectly still. One of the men standing near the fireplace shifted his weight as though expecting Lorenzo to end the conversation immediately, but the Mafia Boss simply studied the woman standing before him with quiet curiosity. There was something unusual about the way she carried herself. She did not beg. She did not negotiate. She did not attempt to earn sympathy. She stood with the calm dignity of someone who had already survived the hardest day of her life. Lorenzo slowly sat down behind the wide walnut desk and folded his hands together. "Tell me about your father." Grace hesitated, not because she wished to hide anything, but because speaking his name aloud still made the loss feel painfully real. "My father worked as a city maintenance mechanic for almost 30 years. He fixed heating systems in schools and public buildings. He believed if something was broken, it deserved another chance instead of being thrown away." A faint smile appeared on her face before fading almost instantly. That included people. Lorenzo remained silent, allowing her words to fill the room. Grace continued quietly. 5 years ago, he became sick. At first, he insisted it was only exhaustion. He kept working overtime because he wanted me to finish college without worrying about tuition. By the time the doctors discovered the truth, he could barely climb the stairs in our apartment. She tightened her grip on the worn handbag resting against her side. I left school during my junior year. I never told them I withdrew. Every morning I pretended I was going to campus, but instead I cleaned offices downtown. In the evenings I worked as a maid at a hotel, and on weekends I cleaned private homes. I wanted him to believe everything was still normal. Lorenzo noticed the roughness on her hands as she spoke. They were not the hands of someone who had spent years behind a classroom desk. They carried tiny scars, dry skin, and the quiet evidence of endless hours spent working with cleaning supplies and hot water. Grace looked toward the envelope resting untouched on the desk. He never stopped apologizing. Every hospital visit, every prescription, every bill made him feel like he was stealing my future. I kept telling him he was wrong because he had spent my entire childhood building mine. Her voice softened as memories returned with painful clarity. Last week he asked me to open the top drawer beside his bed. Inside was an old notebook filled with numbers written in his handwriting. At the very end was one sentence. She paused, swallowing carefully before repeating the words exactly as she remembered them. A promise is worth more than money because money disappears, but a promise tells the world who you are. Lorenzo listened without interrupting. Grace slowly lifted her eyes once more. The morning before he passed away, he made me promise that no matter how difficult life became, I would never allow his name to become a burden on someone else. I did not come here because I expect mercy. I came because I gave my father my word, and keeping that promise is the only thing I have left that still belongs to him. For several long seconds, Lorenzo DeLuca did not reach for the envelope. His attention remained fixed on Grace as though every word she had spoken carried a weight greater than the stack of financial reports resting across his desk. Around them, the room seemed frozen beneath the warm afternoon light spilling through the tall windows. Finally, Lorenzo leaned back in his chair. "Open the envelope," he said quietly. Grace obeyed without hesitation. Inside were several neatly organized money orders, a small savings account statement, and a handwritten list showing every dollar she had managed to save over the past 4 years. She placed them carefully across the polished wood. "This is everything I have." One of Lorenzo's advisors stepped forward, adjusted his glasses, and quickly reviewed the documents before letting out a short breath that almost sounded like disappointment. "Sir," he said respectfully, "this amount is not even close." Grace lowered her eyes, but remained standing straight. "I know," the advisor continued. "Your father borrowed considerably more than this. Even if you worked every single day for years, it would not cover the full balance." The words landed heavily inside the quiet office, yet Grace neither argued nor pleaded. She simply nodded once, as though she had already expected that answer before walking through the front gate. Lorenzo watched her carefully. "Then why come today?" he asked. Grace answered without taking time to think. "Because today is the first day I could begin." Lorenzo rested one elbow against the arm of his chair. Most people disappear after a funeral. They change cities. They change names. They convince themselves another person's promise is no longer their responsibility. Grace looked toward the family photograph resting on a nearby bookshelf. It showed Lorenzo standing beside an elderly woman many years earlier. There was warmth in that picture that did not exist anywhere else inside the room. "My father raised me differently," she replied. "He always said that character is what remains after everything else is taken away." Another silence settled between them. Lorenzo slowly stood and walked around the desk until he stopped only a few feet away. He was close enough to notice the faint circles beneath Grace's eyes, the exhaustion hidden beneath careful composure, and the small crease in her coat sleeve where she had repeatedly gripped the fabric to steady herself. "Tell me honestly," he said, "did someone force you to come here?" Grace shook her head. "No, sir." "Did anyone threaten you?" "No." "Then why are you willing to carry a burden that legally belongs to a man who is no longer alive?" Grace answered with quiet certainty. "Because love does not end with paperwork." The words caught even the advisor by surprise. Lorenzo remained expressionless, yet something almost invisible shifted behind his calm blue eyes. He had spent decades listening to promises made out of fear, greed, and convenience. This sounded different. Grace slowly pushed the savings statement a little closer to him. "I am not asking you to forgive the debt. I am asking you to let me earn the chance to repay it. I can clean. I can cook. I can organize records. I have worked in hotels, offices, and private homes. I will take any honest work you offer. Every paycheck can go toward what my father owed until every dollar is accounted for. One of the men near the fireplace quietly whispered that it would take decades. Grace heard him, but did not react. Lorenzo looked from the savings statement to the calluses on her hands before speaking once more. You are offering me years of your life without knowing the full amount. Grace met his eyes without hesitation. No, sir. I am offering you my word. The years belong to God. I only decide how I spend today. The office remained silent long after Grace finished speaking. No one reached for the papers spread across the desk. No one challenged her conviction. Lorenzo De Luca simply walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling estate, slipping one hand into his pocket as golden afternoon light reflected across the polished marble floor. From where he stood, he could see gardeners trimming hedges with careful precision, chauffeurs preparing vehicles for the evening, and employees moving through the estate with practiced discipline. Every person on the property had arrived because they wanted something: money, security, influence, opportunity. Yet the woman standing behind him had arrived, offering the only thing that could not be purchased: her word. Lorenzo had spent more than 20 years reading people before they spoke. Fear revealed itself through restless eyes. Deception lived inside unnecessary explanations. Greed usually appeared disguised as desperation. Grace Williams displayed none of them. Instead, she carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had been giving pieces of herself away for years without expecting anything in return. He slowly turned back toward the room. His advisor was already waiting. Sir, there is no practical reason to continue this discussion. We can arrange a legal settlement and close the file this afternoon. Lorenzo did not answer immediately. His eyes rested once more on the worn handbag sitting beside Grace's feet. The leather had faded from years of use, but every stitch had been repaired instead of replaced. Even that small detail spoke of someone who valued preservation over comfort. Grace, Lorenzo said calmly, when was the last time you bought something for yourself? She seemed surprised by the question. I am not sure. Try. She thought for several seconds. About 3 years ago. A pair of winter boots. The old ones had holes in the soles. Lorenzo nodded almost imperceptibly. And before that, a faint smile touched her lips. Probably a birthday cake for my father. He insisted we share one every year, even after I became an adult. The advisor looked confused by the direction of the conversation, but Lorenzo continued. Your savings account shows regular deposits every Friday. Small amounts. $10, $20, sometimes $50. Grace answered quietly. Whatever remained after rent, groceries, medicine, and utilities. You never missed a week. No, sir. Lorenzo walked back toward the desk and picked up the account statement for the first time. His eyes moved slowly across the pages. The pattern fascinated him more than the total. Consistency, patience, discipline. These were qualities that could not be borrowed. They had to be lived. He placed the papers back exactly where he had found them. Do you know what impressed me the least today? Grace looked uncertain. No, sir. The money. She remained silent. Anyone can save money if circumstances allow it. What interests me is that you arrived with complete honesty. You could have hidden the account. You could have claimed poverty and asked for sympathy. Instead, you placed everything you owned on my desk before I asked. Grace answered with the same steady voice she had carried since entering the estate. If I started with dishonesty, then every payment afterward would lose its meaning. Something inside Lorenzo shifted again. It was not emotion, at least not one he recognized immediately. It was respect, arriving quietly and without permission. He had built his life around contracts, obligations, and promises enforced by signatures. Yet this woman believed a spoken promise carried greater weight than any document. As the silence settled once more, Lorenzo reached for the intercom resting on the corner of his desk. He pressed the button only once. Have Mr. Sullivan bring me everything we have on Daniel Williams. Every document, every payment record, every note connected to his file. I do not want a summary. I want the complete history. Grace looked at him with quiet confusion. Lorenzo released the button without taking his eyes off her. Before I decide what you owe, he said calmly, I need to find out what your father was truly trying to repay. Less than 20 minutes later, the quiet rhythm of polished shoes echoed through the hallway as an older man entered the study carrying 2 thick storage boxes filled with folders whose edges had yellowed with time. Thomas Sullivan had managed Lorenzo DeLuca's financial records for nearly 3 decades, and nothing entered or left the archives without passing through his careful hands. He set both boxes gently on the conference table before adjusting his glasses. Everything connected to Daniel Williams is here, sir. The file goes back almost 12 years. Lorenzo nodded once. Leave us. Thomas hesitated, glancing briefly toward Grace before quietly closing the door behind him. The office fell silent again except for the soft rustle of paper as Lorenzo opened the oldest folder. Grace remained standing where she had been, uncertain whether she should speak. She chose not to. Lorenzo appreciated that choice more than she realized. One page after another revealed payment receipts, handwritten notes, hospital invoices, and copies of checks. Every few months another payment had been made, sometimes only $50, sometimes a few hundred, but never once had Daniel Williams missed an opportunity to reduce the balance whenever he could. Lorenzo noticed something unusual. The payments became smaller as the years passed, yet they never completely stopped. Even during months when medical expenses clearly exceeded Daniel's income, another payment still appeared in the records. Lorenzo frowned thoughtfully before opening a sealed envelope attached to the inside cover. It contained a handwritten letter dated almost 4 years earlier. Daniel's handwriting was uneven but carefully formed. Mr. DeLuca, I know this payment is smaller than I promised. My treatments have become more expensive, and my daughter does not know I borrowed this money. She believes overtime at work covers everything. Please do not tell her the truth. She has already sacrificed enough because of me. One day I will make this right. Lorenzo read the letter twice before placing it carefully on the desk. Grace stared at the floor, completely unaware of what her father had written. He opened another folder containing copies of hospital statements. Every major payment Daniel had received from Lorenzo matched the exact cost of surgeries, medications, rehabilitation appointments, and specialist consultations. There were no luxury purchases, no vacations, no expensive vehicles, no unexplained transfers. Every dollar had gone toward survival. Lorenzo continued reading until another document caught his attention. It was an interview summary prepared years earlier by one of his own investigators. The report described Daniel as dependable, respected by coworkers, and known throughout his neighborhood for repairing broken furnaces free of charge during harsh Chicago winters for elderly families who could not afford the service. Another page described weekends spent volunteering at a community center teaching teenagers basic repair skills so they could find honest work after graduation. Lorenzo slowly leaned back in his chair. None of this resembled the portrait of a careless borrower. His eyes drifted toward Grace. She stood patiently with folded hands, waiting without complaint despite having no idea that every page seemed to confirm the character she had described. Finally, Lorenzo spoke. Did your father ever tell you why he came to me instead of a bank? Grace looked surprised. No, sir. He only said that when every ordinary door closed, one unexpected door remained open. Lorenzo lowered his eyes to the final folder. Tucked inside was a single receipt that had never been mentioned in previous reports. It showed that Daniel had insisted on making one last payment only 3 weeks earlier despite his worsening condition. Attached beneath it was another short handwritten note. If I cannot finish this journey myself, I pray my daughter never has to carry my burden. Lorenzo closed the folder slowly. The room grew impossibly quiet because for the first time in many years, he realized Daniel Williams had spent 12 years trying not to protect himself, but to protect the daughter who had walked into his office determined to fulfill a promise her father had desperately hoped she would never have to make. Grace waited without interrupting as Lorenzo carefully returned every document to its folder, preserving each page exactly as he had found it. The late afternoon sun had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the study and softening the sharp lines of the room. At last, Lorenzo closed the final box and looked directly at her. Your father spent 12 years trying to keep one promise, he said quietly. Now you are trying to keep the same one. Grace nodded. Yes, sir. Lorenzo remained silent for another moment before asking, if I told you this debt would require the next 20 years of your life, would your answer change? Grace did not hesitate. No, sir. You would give up your future? A gentle sadness crossed her face. My father spent his future raising me. I cannot pretend mine is more valuable than his. Lorenzo stood and walked slowly toward the fireplace, resting one hand on the carved wooden mantel as he considered the woman standing behind him. Throughout his career, he had learned that people often revealed themselves when presented with impossible choices. Some protected comfort, others protected pride. Very few protected principle. He turned back toward Grace. I have a proposal. She listened carefully. Beginning tomorrow morning, you will report to this estate at 7 o'clock. You will not work as a servant because you owe me money. You will work because every honest job deserves honest pay. Grace blinked in surprise, but remained quiet. Lorenzo continued. Half of every paycheck will go toward the outstanding balance. The other half will remain yours. You will keep a roof over your head, buy groceries, and live with dignity. A promise should never require someone to stop living. Grace stared at him, almost unable to process what she had heard. You would allow me to keep half? Yes. Even though it will take longer? Lorenzo nodded once. A debt repaid through desperation teaches nothing. A debt repaid through integrity teaches everything. Before Grace could respond, one of the senior advisors stepped forward. Sir, forgive me, but this arrangement makes no financial sense. At this rate, the account may remain open for decades. Lorenzo's expression remained calm. Then it remains open. The advisor looked genuinely confused. Sir, Lorenzo slowly walked toward the large window again. There are accounts measured in dollars, and there are accounts measured in character. I have spent enough years calculating the first. Today I am interested in the second. The room fell silent once more. Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes, but she fought to keep her composure. She had promised herself before entering the estate that she would not cry, no matter what happened. She had come to honor her father, not to seek pity. Lorenzo noticed the quiet struggle written across her face. One more condition, he said. Grace immediately answered, anything. You will never hide your own needs the way your father did. She looked at him, puzzled. Lorenzo continued, if you become sick, you tell us. If your apartment has no heat, you tell us. If your paycheck cannot cover groceries 1 month, you tell us. I have read enough letters written by parents who believed sacrificing themselves was the only way to love their children. I will not watch that story repeat itself. Grace lowered her head, overcome not by charity, but by being understood. Then, for the first time since entering the estate, she allowed herself a small, grateful smile. I accept every condition, sir. Lorenzo extended his hand across the polished desk. Grace looked at it for a brief moment before placing her worn, hard-working hand into his. There was no contract between them, no attorney, no witness signing official papers. Only a handshake and two people who believed that the strongest agreements were still the ones built on honor. The next morning, Grace Williams arrived at the DeLuca estate at exactly 7 o'clock, 10 minutes before anyone expected her. The early Chicago air carried a crisp chill across the gardens as sunlight slowly climbed over the stone walls surrounding the property. She wore the same carefully pressed navy coat, her shoes polished despite their age, and carried the same worn leather handbag that had become almost an extension of her life. Margaret Ellis, the estate manager, greeted her with professional courtesy before handing her a simple schedule. You will assist with housekeeping, inventory, and guest preparation. If you need anything, you ask. Grace smiled gently. Thank you, ma'am. Within hours, she had memorized the layout of the enormous residence without drawing attention to herself. She dusted shelves lined with family photographs instead of expensive decorations first, carefully straightened books whose corners had been bent by years of reading, and polished windows until afternoon light flooded every hallway with quiet warmth. She treated every room as though someone she loved lived there rather than someone she feared. The other employees noticed immediately. During lunch, while several members of the staff gathered around a long table in the service kitchen, Grace quietly unpacked a homemade sandwich and an apple. When she noticed one of the younger kitchen assistants searching every pocket with growing panic, she leaned over gently. Is something wrong? The young man sighed. I forgot my wallet at home. I guess lunch will have to wait. Without saying another word, Grace slid half of her sandwich onto a clean napkin and placed it beside him. Please, she said with a warm smile. Food tastes better when it is shared. He tried to refuse, but she simply smiled again and continued eating as though nothing unusual had happened. No one commented, yet everyone at the table noticed. Later that afternoon, she found one of the gardeners struggling to carry several heavy flower pots across the courtyard. Although the task was not part of her assignment, she quietly rolled up the sleeves of her uniform and helped move every planter into place before returning to her own work without expecting thanks. By the end of the week, employees who had barely spoken to one another for months had begun greeting each other with unexpected kindness. Small conversations replaced uncomfortable silence. Laughter occasionally drifted through the service hallways. Margaret found herself smiling more often without realizing why. Lorenzo noticed the difference before anyone else admitted it aloud. From the second-floor balcony outside his study, he occasionally watched the staff moving through the estate below. Grace never worked quickly for the sake of appearances. She worked carefully because she believed every task deserved respect. When she folded fresh towels, every edge aligned perfectly. When she arranged flowers in the dining room, she quietly removed the fading blossoms first so the arrangement would brighten someone else's day. She never realized anyone was watching. One rainy evening, Lorenzo happened to pass the staff in trance as employees prepared to leave. He noticed Grace standing beneath the covered walkway beside an elderly janitor, whose old pickup truck refused to start. Rather than rushing toward her own bus stop, she remained beside him, holding an umbrella over both of them while patiently calling a roadside assistance service from her cell phone. She stayed until help arrived, even though it meant missing the last direct bus home and adding nearly an hour to her commute. She never mentioned the delay the following morning. Lorenzo said nothing, but another quiet realization settled into his heart. Grace Williams was not performing acts of kindness because she believed someone powerful might reward her. She behaved exactly the same whether she was being observed or completely alone. For the first time in many years, Lorenzo found himself wondering whether the greatest inheritance Daniel Williams had left his daughter was never the promise she came to fulfill, but the character she carried into every room without ever asking anyone to notice. Nearly 3 weeks passed, and the rhythm of the DeLuca estate settled into a quiet routine that somehow felt lighter than before Grace Williams had arrived. Every Friday afternoon, she personally delivered half of her paycheck to Thomas Sullivan, asking him to record every dollar against her father's balance. She never asked how much remained. She never requested a revised total. To her, the number mattered less than the promise itself. Thomas began placing each payment receipt into Daniel Williams's file with unexpected care, quietly wondering how many people still believe commitments should be honored when no one was forcing them to continue. One gray afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the study windows, Thomas returned carrying a small cedar box covered in a thin layer of dust. "Sir," he said, setting it gently on Lorenzo's desk. "I found this while reorganizing the old storage room beneath the archives. It was filed separately from the financial records. I almost overlooked it because there was no account number attached." Lorenzo lifted the lid carefully. Inside rested several aging photographs, a faded leather wallet, and a sealed envelope marked only with his late father's name written in neat handwriting. He frowned. Why was this separated from the other documents? Thomas adjusted his glasses. "I believe your father instructed that it remain private." Lorenzo slowly opened the envelope. The paper inside had yellowed with time, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. It was not written by his father. It was signed by Daniel Williams. Lorenzo read silently as the room grew impossibly still. "Mr. DeLuca, I hope you will forgive me for refusing your offer. You insisted that the money was a gift after your son's accident, but I cannot accept that. A father should never profit from helping another father. Please allow me to repay you little by little. Knowing your son recovered safely is already more than enough reward." Lorenzo stopped reading. His heartbeat slowed as memories he had buried years ago quietly returned. He had been only 16 when a winter school bus lost control on an icy road outside Chicago. His father had rushed to the scene before emergency crews arrived. One witness had reportedly climbed beneath the damaged vehicle to help frightened students escape before first responders reached them. Lorenzo remembered almost nothing except waking in a hospital room and hearing his father repeatedly mention a maintenance worker who refused recognition or publicity. He had never learned the man's name. His father had quietly covered the stranger's medical expenses after learning he had been injured while helping others, insisting that no decent person should carry such a burden alone. Daniel Williams had refused charity and demanded to repay every dollar instead. Lorenzo looked through the remaining photographs with trembling hands. One showed his younger self wrapped in a hospital blanket beside his grateful father. Standing quietly in the background, almost out of frame, was a younger Daniel Williams wearing a work jacket with grease on the sleeves and a shy smile that suggested he wished the camera would point somewhere else. Grace had entered the hallway outside the study carrying freshly pressed linens, unaware of the discovery unfolding inside. Lorenzo stared at the photograph for a long moment before slowly lowering it onto the desk. Every payment Daniel had made over the last 12 years suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. It had never been repayment born from obligation. It had been gratitude born from character. Lorenzo closed his eyes briefly as one undeniable truth settled over him with overwhelming clarity. Grace believed she had come to settle her father's debt, but the forgotten photograph resting beneath his hand revealed something neither of them had ever known. The family that truly owed a debt of honor was not the Williams family. It was the DeLuca family. The following Friday afternoon, Lorenzo DeLuca asked every senior employee to gather in the estate's grand library. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, washing the walnut shelves and polished floors in a warm golden glow that made the room feel less like the headquarters of a powerful empire and more like a family home waiting to witness something important. Grace entered carrying the weekly payment she had prepared the night before, believing this meeting would be no different from the previous ones. She approached Thomas Sullivan with the familiar envelope in her hands. "This week's payment," she said softly. Thomas accepted it, but did not place it inside the file. Instead, he looked toward Lorenzo, who stood quietly beside the fireplace holding the cedar box and the faded photograph discovered only days before. Grace sensed that something had changed, although she could not imagine what. Lorenzo stepped forward until only a few feet separated them. "Grace," he said calmly, "before anything else happens today, there is something your father never wanted you to know." He handed her the old photograph. Grace looked down and immediately recognized her father's younger face standing quietly in the background beside a frightened teenage boy wrapped in a hospital blanket. Her eyes moved slowly toward Lorenzo, confusion replacing certainty. Lorenzo spoke with unusual softness. "That boy was me." The room fell completely silent. Grace looked back at the photograph as though seeing it for the first time. Lorenzo continued, "Years ago, my father offered financial help after your father risked everything to help strangers during a terrible accident. Daniel refused to accept it as charity. He insisted on repaying every dollar because he believed kindness should never become profit. My father respected that decision, but he also kept every letter your father wrote." Lorenzo opened the cedar box and gently removed Daniel's final handwritten note. "Your father spent years believing he owed our family. The truth is that our family has owed yours something far greater." Grace felt tears fill her eyes as she carefully held the photograph against her heart. "He never told me," she whispered. Lorenzo smiled gently. "Because he did not help people to become their hero. He helped them because that was the kind of man he chose to be." Lorenzo walked to the large oak table where Daniel's financial file rested beside every payment Grace had faithfully made since joining the estate. Without ceremony, he closed the file, placed both hands upon it for a brief moment, and then handed it to Thomas. "Mark this account permanently settled." Thomas nodded with quiet emotion before stamping the final page with one simple word: "Closed." Lorenzo then turned back toward Grace and handed her the envelope containing every paycheck deduction she had made during the past several weeks. "This belongs to you." Grace immediately shook her head. "I cannot accept it." Lorenzo answered with calm certainty. "You are not accepting charity. You are accepting the truth. Your father paid every debt that mattered long before you walked through my front gate." He then placed a small set of house keys into her hand. "Your apartment building was recently listed for sale. I purchased it yesterday. The unit you call home now belongs to you. No mortgage. No rent. Consider it a thank you that should have been spoken many years ago." Grace could no longer hold back her tears. She covered her mouth as emotion finally overcame the strength she had carried for so long. Every employee in the room remained perfectly still, each understanding they were witnessing something money could never buy. Lorenzo looked once more at the photograph of Daniel Williams and quietly said, "Your father believed promises defined a person's character. He kept his. You." Kept yours. Now it is my turn to keep mine. Grace looked at the photograph, then at the people surrounding her, and finally back at Lorenzo with a grateful smile that reflected both sorrow and peace. In that quiet room, no one remembered the balance that had once been written inside an old ledger. They remembered only a humble father who had lived with honor, a daughter who refused to abandon his promise, and the day everyone present learned that the greatest debts are never measured in dollars, but in the dignity we leave behind.